Greetings fellow Mist Wanderers, my name is Steve Morgan and this is DM of the Mists, covering all things Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft. Got a bit of a different video for you today, and this has all been inspired by YouTube comments on another video. So a few weeks ago I put out a video discussing whether the new Bastion rules from the 5th edition updated 2024 rules would work in things like Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft, and spoiler alert for that video I guess, which you can watch yourself if you want to. I talked about how I don't think it would work in Curse of Strahd, but for a wider Ravenloft campaign, perhaps a sequel to Curse of Strahd, it could work well. And my players sort of have a Bastion, they have a base. We're not using Bastion rules and it predates Bastion rules, but I talked about my experiences, it worked well. In the comments, there was a comment from a regular commenter, I recognise their comments from other videos, by the name of Haytham Kenway 383. And they talked about how they agreed with my points and they were considering making Van Richten's shop in Mordant, a bastion for the players, which is quite a cool concept. And then they said something that really piqued my attention. My version of Van Richten is heavily inspired by Luthen Rael from Andor, so Luthen's antique shop is a big inspiration for Van Richten's store. Now, in addition to D&D and Ravenloft, I wouldn't say I'm a die-hard fanatical fan of Star Wars, but I watched the movies as a kid, the original trilogy, watched the prequel trilogy a bit older, watched some but not all of the newer Disney ones, loved Rogue One, I've enjoyed things like The Mandalorian and Ahsoka, and I absolutely loved Andor. So when I heard Andor in the same sentence as Ravenloft, I was like, yes please, you've ticked both my boxes there. I asked this commenter, love to hear more. What do you plan? Like, I'm a big Andor fan, and I love the idea of VR being similar to Luthen. And thankfully they were happy to share their points. And I'm going to, this video is essentially going to be repeating some of the points and discussing them a bit more and adding to them and potentially thinking of a few. But a big thank you to Haytham Kenway 383 for all these comments. And I want to stress, this is all them and very slightly tiny bit me adding. I don't want people to think that this is all my idea or whatever. But it's funny how many comparisons you can draw and how many similarities there are between Andor and the characters in Andor and Ravenloft and the characters in Ravenloft. Oh, before I move on, in addition to the usual big spoilers for Ravenloft and big spoilers for Curse of Strahd, there's going to be spoilers for Star Wars Andor in this, including Season 2, which only came out a few months ago as I record this, so please be warned. Onto the comparisons. So I'll call Haytham for short. Haytham says that Dr. Van Richten is dedicated to hunting evil after losing his wife and son. That's in the Ravenloft lore, Ingrid and Erasmus. And he starts to develop a network of other monster hunters, which, you know, people like Esmeralda and the weathermay-foxgrove twins in Ravenloft lore is similar to Axis, which is what the ISB, the villains, if you will, the part of the Empire in Andor, classify Luthen and Luthen's network, so there's similarities there. Haytham also says that in the old Van Richten's guidebook, so not 5th edition's Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, but where you had the old Van Richten's Guide to something, it seems as though Van Richten's network was wider and he always had some sort of friend or colleague who could help him with something, like help him defeat this monster or help him to do this quest. Haytham continues by saying their version of Van Richten will use any method to fight monsters, sort of akin to that monologue Luthen gives, the really cool monologue where he says that I have to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. And I remember reading on the Curse of Strahd subreddit a guide by a user called Guild's Bounty who did a write-up on Strahd, on Van Richten, and a few other NPCs. And in that, Guild's Bounty says their version or take on Van Richten is that he would do the same. For example, if a vampire's built their lair on low ground, divert a river to flood the whole thing with running water. Vampire didn't make his coffin under enough layers of solid material, blow or tear the top off and bathe the coffin in daylight. Stuff like that, really like ugly, nasty tactics to get the job done, to kill the monster. Similar tactics to probably what monsters would do to innocent people or the adventurers. So I thought that was really cool and a good take on Van Richten and how it aligns with the Guild's Bounty thing. Haytham continues by saying that the Vistani massacre that's kind of talked about in, I think it's in the Old Lore and it's in the 5th edition lore in like the sort of journal excerpt where it talks about a lich gives Van Richten some zombies to use to kill the Vistani who were responsible for kidnapping his son. Haytham's take is that he regrets the massacre afterwards. It's basically his make it stop moment. So towards the end of season 2 of Andor, you see sort of Luthen's backstory and who he was before he became Luthen Rael, and how he met and adopted Clara. And so that's quite cool. If you do, I'd be careful doing the whole tiger in Vallaki attacking Vistani angle. If you do this, maybe have the tiger in Vallaki, but maybe change it so instead of hunting the Vistani, because it'll kind of discredit that thing. Like in my game, I had it retrained that it could fight the undead. So he's got this tiger that can like hunt zombies and vampires and stuff. So that could be an angle to change it to that doesn't then discredit the whole thing. Because otherwise it's like, you know, he feels guilty for killing those Vistani, but then he's got a tiger trained to attack the Vistani. It kind of doesn't work. So that's one thing I would caution. I did a whole other video talking about Van Richten, by the way, nearly an hour long, if you want more information about Van Richten. And I do address the whole tiger Vistani thing in that. Haytham likes to compare Vial's relationship with Ez to being very similar to Luthen and Clara, and as soon as I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Makes a lot of sense that, you know, Ez was well, not really adopted, but she's from a different background. I think that's a really good comparison. The whole thing about Van Richten's Rictavio, guys, in 5th edition and Curse of Strahd is so similar to Luthen's eccentric shopkeeper persona when he's got the longer hair and he talks a bit more flamboyantly, and the fake smile and things like that. As soon as I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, how did I not piece that together before? And I remember the way I played Rictavio was like really over the top, and, you know, the loudest thing in the room is the last thing you'd suspect. I think I got that from Gil's Bounty as well. But yeah, it's got such a strong comparison to that. And then obviously when he's not in Rictavio mode, he's a lot more brooding, a lot more serious, similar to how Luthen is when he's in his regular guise, I guess, when he's not the shopkeeper and when he's talking to his agents. Haytham continues and says that the Kharjat are inspired by the ISB. So for people watching this familiar with Curse of Strahd but not wider Ravenloft, the Kharjat are the secret police in Darkon, another domain of Dread, who serve Azalin. Although in 5th edition it's more complicated because Azalin has disappeared, ? And there are other Dark Lords trying to fill his spot, one of whom is actually the leader of the Kharjat in 5th edition. Haytham does explain that instead of Alcio being the leader, they decided to keep the original Kharjat leaders from earlier editions. That's either Tavalia or Lady Kazandra, who I think I talked about in another video. Might have been Azalin's Minions video. While Alcio is like Daedra, which is perfect given Alcio's obsession with catching Van Richten matches Daedra's obsession with catching Axis, who's Luthen's network. In this analogy, Lady Kazandra could be Partagaz, and Tavalia could be Yularen, who are two of the sort of higher ranking members, or I was going to say generals, officers. And also, Haytham was going to adapt the Grim Harvest plotline from 2nd edition, which I'm not too familiar with. I came into Ravenloft as a 5th edition. I do delve into older lore, and I know some older lore, but I don't know Grim Harvest. And so Llewellyn Dachine, is how that's pronounced, I'll probably massacre that. Llewellyn Dachine. I know how to pronounce Llewellyn because it's kind of Welsh, and I'm Welsh, but it's the Dachine that's throwing me off. But Llewellyn Dachine is basically Krennic, so that's cool. And they finish off by saying, depending on whether Escher survives Curse of Strahd, he might end up working for Alcio as a Cyril stand-in. I think that's great as well, that makes sense. Cyril's a great character for those of you familiar with it, and Escher does kind of fit that. So yeah, lots of comparisons there. That was kind of Haytham's write-up. And big shout, again, big love, big shout out to Haytham, and I asked Haytham for permission to turn this into a video, and they gave their blessing, which was amazing. Some extra points and comparisons I picked up on, only a few, because I think Haytham nailed it in their comments. And like I say, go to the Bastion video and read the comments to kind of see it all in detail and stuff. But different domains kind of remind me of different planets from Star Wars. So like, it's almost like the mists around the domains, because they're all isolated and they're quite difficult to travel to different domains. Almost reminds me of like space around the different planets, and how each planet is almost like a different culture, and that's true of Ravenloft and the Domains of Dread. Demonio and Richemulo are analogues for France, much like Gorman in Star Wars and in Andor. It got me thinking as well, if Alcio is Daedra and that the Kharjat are like the ISB, could the Emperor be Azalin? That could be quite cool, quite interesting comparison. Maybe, maybe not. It gets complicated, I guess, when you're talking about the sort of good versus evil of Star Wars is the rebellion versus the Empire. You know, it's just like one big evil, whereas in Ravenloft and Domains of Dread, they're like all different isolated types of evil. But still, it's kind of cool to have that kind of, you know, the Karjat fitting the big evil organization definitely fits that. And going back to Luthen's monologue to Jonni Lung, I think the character was called, where that classic thing in the episode where it's like, what do I sacrifice? Everything. And even some of the lines of the analogue fit Ravenloft. I share my dreams of ghosts made me think of Van Richten's family and Mordant, which is ghost story country. And there's sun analogies as well. I've made my mind a sunless space. And also the line, I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. And that brings me comparisons to 5th edition version of Barovia and in Curse of Strahd, where the sunlight isn't actually sunlight for the purposes of sunlight sensitivity to vampires, vulnerability. It's bright daylight and people can still see it, but it doesn't affect vampires. So what do you think? I was really surprised at how many comparisons there are to Ravenloft and to Andor, which I think is a testament to how good both of them are, how good the writing is, how good the characters are. You know, Andor is easily my favourite Star Wars thing, having grown up with it and watched it for decades. One thing, I guess, is Haytham's take, and same with Gil's Bounty, might not match other people's view of Van Richten, or how he's portrayed in other things. Minor spoiler now for Heir of Strahd. Please click away, pause, mute if you don't want this spoilt. This is a few months out now, so I think I'm good to talk openly about it in other videos. But Van Richten appears in Heir of Strahd, and he comes across as quite sort of eccentric and aloof in his regular guise. You know, I don't think the Rictavio disguise is shown at all. And, you know, you might not think of Van Richten in Heir of Strahd and in other media would be the kind of person who would do Luthen's type stuff, tools of the enemy, ruthless tactics to kill monsters. But you can't deny, even in spite of that, you can't deny the similarities between the two settings and the two mediums. I just thought it'd be cool to talk about because I love Andor, I love Ravenloft, and I got to geek out about both in one video. How cool is that? And that's it for this one. August was busy, but I'm hoping to get back more in a routine of aiming for a video once a week, once a fortnight at the most. I haven't got my list to hand, but I've got quite a few ideas on both the Curse of Strahd and Ravenloft fronts. On Curse of Strahd, I think I want to do a video talking about the 3 items from the Taroka reading, talking about what they are, how they work, but also additional things you can consider. For example, for the Tome of Strahd, you might want to consider the interactive Tome of Strahd, things like that. Ravenloft, I want to do a video talking about more recurring villain NPCs you can add who aren't Dark Lords and who can sort of appear and disappear, and they might escape and then come back. And more good NPCs, good in the sense of alignment, but I think they're good as well in terms of, you know, good versus bad. But yeah, so if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and see you in one of my future videos. Thank you, Mr. Wanderers. And I want to end off as well by saying something like, may the force be with you as well. May the mists be with you. No, that doesn't quite work. You get what I mean.